except for Bob on the iPhone. I don't know what Bob is saying. But other than that, can I interrupt myself and say, can we enter into a moment of prayer? Holy God, we are grateful for the gift of today. Thankful for the ups, the downs, the twists, the turns, the curves, and all that made up this wonderful day. For God, this is the day that you've given us, and for that we're grateful. As we enter into this time of togetherness, of learning, of growing, of discussion, God, help us to open our hearts and our minds to what you would have us to know, to do, and to move according to your spirit. We thank you for another opportunity to share, to give, and to serve. Bless us now, individually and collectively, this day. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen now. Let's see how successful I am, because as we know, the virtual world is never faithful. Do you all see that?
It's coming.
It's coming.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Are we there? Can you hear me now? Yeah. Awesome. I will always sprinkle in a little jokes because that's just who I am. In my mind, in another life, I'm a stand-up comedian. So, but the Lord has chosen me for this work, and it is marvelous in my eyes. So, navigating difficult conversations. I wanted to start with two givens, and I always think about my time in high school. I grew up in Philadelphia. My time in high school when I had to study geometry. And if you remember anything about geometry, there were two things. There was one thing that was always certain in any geometry math problem. There was a given. And your job in geometry was then to prove what was given. And so I always start with a given whenever I do a presentation. Two things here. First is, I'm not sure if we are all aware of this, and I know you've had several conversations with other folks, but race is a social construct. We're talking about different conversations as it concerns race. We have to understand that race is a made up thing. It's not something that's always been there. It's something that has come along the way. It's a grouping of humans based on shared physical and social qualities in the categories generally viewed as distinct by society. It's a social or societal construct. The term was first used to refer to speakers of a common language and then denote national affiliations. But by the 17th century, it was begun to use in racist ways. And scientists used it to show that physical traits or that white folks were superior to people of color in some way. And also remember that race is not mentioned in the Bible. When you think about it, nationality is what is prevalent in the Bible, not race. People are Samaritans, people are Israelites, people are from Judea. They're not white folks and Middle Easterners and Black folks and all that type of thing. That is something we have made up, and race is a social construct. So that's number one. I want us to keep in our minds. And a lot of people don't ever think about it in that way. Number two, since we're talking about difficult conversations are both uncomfortable and necessary at the same time. I'm sure in your life you've had to have some difficult conversations with somebody you love, you care about, or someone that just needed a talking to and whatever. Maybe you had to fire somebody. Maybe you had to tell someone that a loved one had passed away. Maybe you had to have a conversation with your child about why they could no longer drive the car after they drove it through the driveway. Through the garage. All these are difficult conversations and oftentimes uncomfortable, but always necessary at the same time. They are critical to make room for dialogue that is essential to the creation of a welcoming environment and the perpetuation of beloved community. Because at the end of the day, it's our job as the church to live into what it means to be the beloved community of God. And so I want to structure my time then around some facts for you to consider. Perfect. One, when it comes to having difficult conversations around race, we do not all come to the table from the same vantage point. What I mean is some of us come from a point that we've been talking about race for a long time and we're used to conversations about it and we know how to conduct ourselves. Other ones of us have been brought up in an environment where you don't talk about race and politics and sex. These are things you don't talk about at all in public. And so we are very naive to what it means to have conversations about difficult subjects such as race. Also, we don't all come from the same vantage point of our upbringing and what we bring to the table. Some of us come from a more privileged, some of us come from a less privileged, more affluent, less affluent. Some of us come with different educational levels, different vernaculars and dialects, and all of that must be considered when you enter into a difficult conversation. It's not a level playing field in any way, shape, or form. We both come from our own particular cultural backgrounds, our own particular social standings, and all that we bring to the table. In essence, we all come with our own biases and must recognize that up front in order to properly engage in difficult conversations. Any questions so far? I can't see you all, so you would have to shout out. I'm gonna keep going. I like to talk. I'm a preacher. This is what we do. Number two, difficult conversations on race are at least a two-tier process. At least. What does that mean? So glad you asked at the exact right time. Internal and external dialogue are key factors. What I mean by internal dialogue is that in order for a successful, difficult conversation on race to occur, there has to be some homogeneous conversation first. Meaning, it's a good opportunity for folks who are part of the same racial construct to have conversations about their own biases, their own concerns, their own fears, their own joys and concerns before you try to enter into a conversation. Talk about your own stereotypes, things that you talk about when nobody else is around. And if we're honest with each other, we all have those conversations. In my particular culture, we call them in the house conversations and out of the house conversations. Meaning there's some conversations you have with people who are on your own family unit and conversations and things you don't talk about with people who are not in your own family unit. My suggestion here is that in the first tier of the process of having difficult conversation is that we need to face some things that we deal with within our own racial groups. And so, and that's an example, white folks need to talk to white folks first. Talk about the things we don't talk about in public. Talk about the places where there are definitely stereotypes that exist and things that we've created in our minds as truth and may or may not be truth. That is essential to know where you stand before you can have the second tier of the conversation, which is an external dialogue. And I say an external dialogue is when there's more than one race in the room. That is people of color and white folks, or whatever the case might be. And I say at least two tier because, in some respects, because of the fact that we are Americans and we live in a society that and within a denomination that has a very traumatic and tumultuous history around race, especially as it concerns Black folks and Indigenous First Nation people, that sometimes it's necessary to have that dialogue first before anybody else of color is around the conversation. And so, it might be important to iron out some things with Black and white before we include our Latinx and Asian siblings as well into the conversation. It's not to say that those particular folks are any lesser, but it was to say that sometimes there is a history that must be acknowledged around what has happened in this country and in this denomination for Black and white understanding. Understand the historical and cultural facts and traditions before engaging, which is closely related to what I just mentioned. There are cultural norms. There are certain ways, for instance, in my particular culture, we don't address our elders by their first name. For instance, if you were on the call early, not that this person is an elder by any means, but older than me, I said, hello, Reverend Angela, Dr. Angela. And so, not to say that she might be the same age as me, but in my mind, I am addressing her out of reverence. You see what I'm saying? But that's a cultural thing. So understand cultural norms as they appear and as they are intrinsic to the dialogue that is necessary. For some folks in Asian cultures, it's disrespectful and or it's not. Excuse me. It's not. What is the word for? It's not common to speak up and assert yourself in a conversation. There are some colleagues where if I don't ask them their opinion, they're not going to offer it because it's considered disrespectful to speak up in that manner. Whereas we, other folks who might say it's important to be assertive and to speak up and have your opinion heard. So when engaging in dialogue and making sure that all participants have equal footing in the conversation and the ability to have equal footing, it's important to recognize cultural traditions as well as historic facts. I just talked about sometimes we need to acknowledge the history that has happened in our denomination and in our country as it concerns race. You can't go into a difficult conversation about race without having foreknowledge beyond just slavery about what has happened in this country. And that's important. So in essence, it's do your own homework first. Come to the conversation educated and ready. And I'm not saying you have to read the entire series on Indigenous and First Nation history. What I'm saying is come from a point of view that is at least informed enough to know how to engage people. and be respectful enough to ask if you don't know. It's better to ask than to assume. Next one, number 4. We are all experts of our own lived experience. One of the things that has been very off putting when I've had to engage in difficult conversations is when someone who's outside of my particular group, and whatever the group that might be, tries to tell me what my experience is. We are all experts on our own lived experience. I cannot tell you what it means to live in the skin of a white man, nor that you can tell me what it means to live in the skin. If you're not that, then you can tell me what it means to live in the skin of a black non-binary person if you're not that. It's a totally different um, way of being in the world. And that's respected. Each person comes from their own particular vantage point and is an expert of their own lived experience. And as Presbyterians, that's something we don't always acknowledge nor champion. We are people of the written word. We love things that are in books, things that people said that who are now dead, things that we can hang our hat on. We don't always privilege education in the same. We don't always privilege lived experience in the same way we do education. And what I'm offering to you is I invite you to look at lived experience in a way that is about having an education that you cannot learn in academia, but it's something that life has taught you and living in your particular place of being has taught you. And that's important to acknowledge and to affirm and to respect when engaging in thoughtful, difficult conversations. Next up, difficult conversations require more listening than talking. What? This is difficult for some of us. We like to hear our own selves talk. If we're honest, we like the sound of our own voices. Here's the thing. If I'm to engage in a conversation with you in which I hope to gain something and to also offer something, then at some point I'm going to need to listen. And not just listen for hearing, but listen for understanding. Lots of times it's more important what you hear and what you're able to comprehend than what you say. And what you say can be based on what you hear and what you comprehend. Having a conversation around race is important to hear the history, the narrative, the pain, the celebration, the disillusion, the frustration, and the excitement, and all the things that are tied up in the lived experience of the other person on across the table from you. And so being able to listen to that with your heart and your mind and your spirit is just as important as sharing your own story, which is also equally important. Next one. Difficult conversations on race are not a one and done event. It is not. If you expect to have a difficult conversation with someone, let's say in particular a colleague, and say we're going to conquer racism today at lunch at 12 o'clock, by 1 o'clock when it's time to go back to work, we have solved it. Guess what? You have solved nothing but hopefully your hunger for lunch. Nothing else has been achieved. It's not a one and done event. Racism didn't happen in a vacuum, in a one and done event. It is something that has persisted and been with us over time, over centuries, over generations. And it's something that we each carry a bit of the residual effects of. None of us started it, none of us are responsible for it. We all have a part in how we dismantle it. And so, in that, it takes more than one conversation and one interaction to do so. It takes multiple conversations, possibly even with multiple different groups of people. Different perspective can be gleaned from someone who is younger and involved in social justice movements than someone who is older who has seen some different things. Different perspectives bring different people bring different perspectives to the conversation, and it's not a one and done event. That's like they say, like when we were told, uh, what was it, 12 years ago, that when President Obama was elected, we are now post-racial society and racism is solved. Well, we kind of know that's not true. That didn't happen. The election of one person into office did not change the racism that exists in our society. And the same thing with these conversations. One will not do. The next thing to consider is implicit and explicit factors when engaging in dialogue. This is so important in any conversation. Something as simple as the environment. Are you asking someone to come into a difficult conversation about race who, in which you set up the chairs in which you are sitting up higher than they are? Are you at a table and they're standing? These things might seem small and minuscule and don't matter, but they matter when it comes to power dynamics, the next thing. Are you engaging in a race conversation with someone that you are a supervisor over? They're going to be less likely, potentially, I would say, less likely to share their true, authentic feelings if there's a power dynamic. What would it look like to engage that conversation outside of the place where you are the supervisor? And what does it look like to engage the conversation outside of an environment that is home based to either party? What about a neutral space? It's always good to have a neutral space to engage in difficult conversations. If it's an interpersonal thing, it's easy because you can go to a coffee shop or something like that. I would encourage you to consider that too in a neutral space, even in a neutral virtual space when you're having difficult conversations. And then language is important too. If the person that speaks Spanish is their first language, um, how are we having a difficult conversation in which we are attuned and acute to that person's their native tongue? So we need to be careful of that too. We don't assume that everybody speaks English, nor that English is everyone's first language. And so we need to be conscious of that as well. Next, conversation is pointless. I say pointless. I say again pointless without change and measured outcomes. That was a reference to a cartoon. If you're old enough to remember that one, I am. Um, it's pointless without change and measured outcomes. We can talk ourselves till we all blue in the face and we all go see King Jesus. But if we don't make any change in our environment, in our interactions, in our policies, in our mission statements, in our vision, and how we evangelize, and how we go forth in ministry, and how we build beloved community, and in how we lead, then it's utterly pointless and futile. That God is calling us to a place of understanding, a place of let us come together and reason together, and a place of sitting down and building what it looks like to be a just people. And so, in doing so, the conversation alone is never enough. It requires a bit of yourself to be given up on both sides so we may equally come to the table. And it requires a change in policy. I caution folks who want to have difficult conversations in church and change the narrative of the church when all your leadership is white or all your leadership is homogeneous and you want to broaden your church. Well, if we have conversations on race and nothing changes about that, then that's an issue. It's an issue. There's still work to be done, and that's okay. You just might not be where you think you are, but you're still moving along the process, and that's okay. And then one other thing I wanted to share too is have a plan. That's great. Have a plan for how you want to engage someone. Think through these factors to consider that I've laid out. And then guess what? Throw it away. And I say throw it away, not in the sense that your plan was not important, but in the sense that be open to how the Spirit shall move. None of us know what God's going to do. And so God can move in the conversation in a way that was it is outside of your realm of plan. And so how are you allowing space for the Spirit to move to lead you to where God is yet calling you to be? And so that's why I say have a plan, definitely go through this, and then throw it away, realizing that God is ultimately in control and the space for grace and the space for the Spirit is super important. One thing that I also want to say on here too, that I want to say that that's not listed here is that if you're looking at having difficult conversations, maybe in between different churches or church leaders, or even at the presbytery level, it's important that there's a buy-in from the totality of your leadership, or at least your clerk of session and a few other folks in key leadership positions. This cannot be something that's shepherded alone by the pastor or key members of the church. It has to be shepherded in a joint effort, because what happens then is it changes the culture of the church, it changes the vision and mission that's being put forth, and it changes the narrative of the outcomes that are going to come down along the way. It's important to have a buy-in. You can't do this alone, that you need more than just you to do the work that God is calling us to in building beloved community. And so I'm going to stop right there for a second. I'm going to stop sharing my screen if I can figure out how. Not sure I can. Oh, it's right there. Oh. And I'm going to open it up for questions. Yes, you will have access to the material, Sue. Um, and I can put some things in the chat if that would be helpful as well. But does anybody have any questions or dialogue around this? Yes, Claudia.
I would love to hear your ideas or other people's ideas of how to get this buy-in within our church I mean, we've agreed to be a Matthew 25 church. We've started some things, some background stuff, but just to how to get people to really understand it and really buy into it. I think we need a lot of education within our congregation, honestly.
Well, I think you might have answered your own question right there. I think it is about education, and I'm wondering also. Can I ask you an additional question to your question? Is what has been the pushback you've been hearing?
It's not necessarily push, it's complacency. It's not really a pushback in sense of I'm not interested or anything like that. It's just a kind of I think it's an unsure, it's an uncomfortableness, it's a newness, and so people are just kind of holding back, I think.
Yeah.
We did do a Bible study and we had plenty of people come to that. I mean, we would have liked to have more, but I'm just wondering what other things can we do to get people engaged and want to work on this do the work.
Well, yeah, it's a great question. First of all, a Bible study is a great way to kind of couch this because it needs to have a theological framework for people to understand that this is really what God is calling us to. I think also that if it comes, I'm sorry, I had a hiccup right there in the middle. I apologize. And then also the message coming across the pulpit and sermons as well is important, so that there is a backup to the Bible study and that it's being shared in multiple ways is important, and then not just the one and done on that either, that it might take multiple sermons or multiple Bible studies for people to finally kind of catch wind of what God is doing, and then leaning in to the discomfort is important. There are some things that are not comfortable. I don't know, I'm not an expert, but what I would think is that the cross was a little uncomfortable, but it might have been just a little bit. And so, as we follow the example of Christ, sometimes we're going to be in places of discomfort, and that's okay because we realize we don't do this alone, understanding that God is with us and that this is the work of dismantling racism, and this is the work of that God is calling for in this moment in history. I really believe that we are living in a moment that's very unique. That
Oh, yeah.
none of us can deny that there is a plethora of racial things that go on in our news every morning. I wake up to CBS News at 7 a.m. and not one segment at one day has gone by without them mentioning race in some way, whether it's connected to COVID, what's going on in the current administration, or whatever the case might be, or within our country, or even within locally here in Louisville with the Breonna Taylor case. So there's always a mention of racism in some way, and so it's a really critical time and easy lift to get it in the conversation. The question then is how do we hold people in the conversation? And sometimes it might be something as simple as making sure that we do it at a time that's a good time of day. I would say
Yeah.
if we were in person, I would say that there were food be there because people always like to talk around food. But
Oh, yeah.
things like that matter. Environment, factors like that matter. So
Okay.
that's how I would answer that question. Sony, you had a question?
Well, Claudia and I are at the same church, okay? And so I think we are trying different things. The Bible study reached a group of people. Our Sunday school class right now is studying the book Quite Too Long. And we had, we're not a big church, and we usually only have, for Sunday school, 15 is probably average, but we had 23 at that class where we were talking about White Too Long. I thought that was great myself in COVID times, and there are several people that are not coming that typically would come, but considering that book, at least for me, reading it is challenging. I mean, I'm hearing things said about church, big church in general, that I honestly hadn't really thought about. So I think it has been a challenging book. I think everything you've presented is it Shanea?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. I appreciated your presentation, and I think that all of the things that you were mentioning about things we need to consider were really, really good. I have to say that I kept hearing John talking before you about what happened in Presbytery yesterday, and it's still ringing in my ear.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I don't think we let that sit. What do we do about that?
I tend to be a person that doesn't shy away from something like that. And so just because folks don't want to engage it doesn't mean that it doesn't need to be engaged, right? And so lots of times what happens is that that frustration when you get to the core of it, because we know sometimes frustration is not the root issue, it's not the root cause, it's the front that's put up. It's because they're uncomfortable with what it might reveal. And it's okay to pull the sheets back and really show what's going on, because until we get to the heart of the matter, nothing will change. And so the resistance to it for me is just fuel to keep going and to keep having these conversations. And so every time might not look like breakout groups, but there's still a conversation every time that happens in some way, shape, or form. And so it might be that you mix it up, that you don't always do this, hit it the same way and do it the same way. Maybe it's a speaker, but next time it's a group, and this time it's an activity, and so forth and so on. And so that it's always something that we have to deal with and reckon with, but just not in the same way,
Mhm.
because we can't give people the privilege to escape. I don't know who Galaxy S9 in the car is, but it looks like they had their hand up, and then Sue.
Mhm.
I'm Jim Boswell from
Hi,
Harvey
Jim.
Brown. Uh, I I think the thing I wrestle with, your presentation was right on, and it's that I believe that I was raised in a racist environment, very subtle. I have to own that. I believe all of us were, and all of us have reactions to racism in a different manner. I have uh, a black gentleman that's my friend that says every time he walks into a store, everybody stops and looks at him, and he feels very uncomfortable with that. Now, is that true, or is he just been raised to be very sensitive to those issues? I don't know. But I remember back in the 60s when we were going through a lot of tumult, there were trained people that were facilitators that ran groups that helped people facilitate and get out those deep seated feelings of angst, fear, anger, or whatever. And I think that's going on right now. And I would urge that the presbytery, our church, because I'm in a church that has a wonderful history and tradition, but it basically is a white church of successful middle class white people. And they have not grown up in a world they know how to open up and accommodate and let in. So uh, I know it needs to be done. I just need in help on how to do it. That's all.
Okay. You said a lot there, and I appreciate your comments. One, I want to say, as a black person who's lived in three cities now for a significant amount of time, I have been followed a lot. I've been looked at a lot.
Okay.
And it's not imaginary, the subtle racism that comes. And it comes from a variety of directions too. And I have experienced it a lot here living in Kentucky, more than I was really prepared for.
I would
And so
expect that.
yeah, I would have expected it, but I didn't expect it. It was uncomfortable when it happened. And so and there's that. But I think once again, like I was saying to Sony and to Claudia's questions before, is that we cannot forgive racism in the sense that we allow it to remain dormant and complicit and complacent. That
Right.
if our eyes have been revealed and opened, then it is our duty and our job to keep pushing the narrative, Because here's the thing, when John 3:16, when Christ calls for whosoever will come to the table and receive this gift, there is no speculation or stipulation on that. And so until we understand that beloved community really means whosoever will, and not just our homogeneous groups, whether it be about race or economic status or as Americans, then we will be able to understand that it is important and imperative to what God is ultimately calling the church to in this season to continue to push this conversation. There is
Amen.
no other conversation outside of how we exist outside of our biases that is more important in the church, in my opinion. We can argue about the bake sale, we can argue about parliamentary procedures, we can argue about all of that, but at the end of the day, what matters is how we allow ourselves out of the way so that Christ may reign supreme. And in doing that, we have to remove the biases and the cover over our eyes that keeps us separated and keeps us believing that one is higher than the other, because once again, race is a social construct.
Yes.
Sue, what's your question?
Well, it's not so much a question, and I'm glad Jim got to go first because I kind of fits in with what he just said. John, I was not one of the people that said I don't like breakouts. I'm not always comfortable with them, but it's mainly because sometimes we don't know exactly what we're supposed to be discussing. The topic is so high level, and unless you have someone in your group that is a leader, you can kind of sit there and look at each other. And like last Saturday, we only had 4 people in our group. And, but it was really unique because one of them was only, they were on their phone and we couldn't see who they were. And it was just a first name. And we finally said, okay, Diane, which Diane is this? And it turned out it was Diane from Shanea. So she was really able to give us a different perspective on some things that we were talking about. So I think if we do have breakouts, it's just helpful to have a couple of questions or a couple of statements that you'd like us to discuss. And
no, and can I just jump in here and say that's a really good point, that having moderators and having designated questions, because the topic of racism is so vast. I don't know what your focus was at the Presbyterian. I can't speak to that. But the topic of racism is so vast and it's so many levels that in order to chip away at it, all its particular intersectional points, it's definitely important to have questions and to kind of guide that in a way that that lets the narrative unfold around a particular topic. I also want to say, in adjacent to that we also have to make sure that we're not relying on the people of color within the situations to answer for all the people of color and to be the resident expert on all things people of color. I can't even be the expert on all things Black. I can't. I try, but I cannot, because we're not a monolithic people. We're not monolithic as Americans. We're not monolithic as individuals. We're not monolithic even as a denomination, my God, today. So we can't be monolithic as individual race groups. And so we always want to make sure that we're not relying on any one person to represent an entire race of people, because that's not fair. And it can be traumatic in some ways.
Well, the conversation actually went on quite a while before we got around to saying, okay, Diane, which Diane are you? So, I mean, it wasn't focused on her.
I wasn't saying that.
Yeah.
You just actually made me think about that point. So I'm not saying you said that.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyone else? Back to you, Claudia.
Yeah, I just thought of something. It's just real quick. Back to what you were saying about, once we become aware and once we become somebody who's willing to look at and think about and talk about, we can't let racism go unconfronted or unacknowledged. And I was in a meeting and it stuck with me, and it's helped me to kind of understand that a little bit. And that was that we were with an African-American woman. She was talking to us about a program that she's doing. And this was a church thing. So our church was very interested in working with her and talking with her. And she was very honest and so direct and honest with us. And I so appreciated it. But she made a comment talking somewhat about the way white people try to help the poor or help another race or help whatever. And she was so right, so absolutely right, what of the things that us white people do. But somebody made the comment of, well, all those white people, they're coming from a good intentions. They're coming from, they mean well. And another person in that group said, we can't use that anymore. We can't say that anymore. It's not okay. You can't come from good intentions without being intentional. You can't come from a place of, oh, I want to do good, but I'm not really going to think about these people that I'm doing good for. So that to me is keeping me in check. That one little incident that keeps me in check of not trying to say, you know, I'm going to screw up. I have screwed up. I have to apologize when I do, and hope I'm forgiven. I mean, that you just have to move on and do better next time, but don't do the same thing.
Yeah,
Don't
yeah,
do it again.
yeah. We definitely all should be learning from our mistakes. What you're talking about is white savior complex, and
Yeah.
that's the thing. I'm going to share too. When I talk about white savior complex, I'm going to share when I share the handout with John. I'm going to share this little video I love from the late night guy Seth. I can't think of his name. Seth Myers. Yes, he does this little skit about white savior complex that is hilarious, and I think you will enjoy. And it illustrates it in a very real and tangible way. Something else that illustrates it very well, in what you're talking about doing what feels like the right thing, but it might be the wrong way, is a story I always like to lift up in First Kings. And it is a story when David and the Levites and the priests are bringing the Ark of the Covenant back from Obed Edom's house and bringing it back to the palace. And at one point, the Levites are the only ones that are supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. And at one point, one of them kind of slips, and the Ark of the Covenant begins to fall. And there's this guy named Uzziah who goes to catch it so it won't fall. And Uzziah is struck dead right there. And it's like, what in the world? But the whole premise that I get from that story is sometimes just because it's the right thing, don't mean it's done the right way. Remember, only the Levites are supposed to touch the Ark of the Covenant. No one else is supposed to have hands on it. And so even though he felt like he was doing the right thing, he was doing it the wrong way, and it ended up causing his own destruction and demise. And it's a really harsh example, but it's a good example of this point. Also, I'm going to share that Seth Meyers clip because that is more modern and that's hilarious.
Yeah, good.
Also, I wanted to point out, I grew up in a home that my grandmother constantly said, the road to hell's lined with good intentions.
Well, there's
Yeah.
that. I think all our grandmas said that.
Well,
Yep.
And I've been and Jim, I just want to acknowledge that you said that you grew up in a racist environment, and I think I appreciate you saying that in the sense that not all of us are courageous enough to say that, and that's real, and it shows that the level you're at dealing with your own baggage, and so I appreciate you just even bringing that up
well,
and realizing that it's a factor.
I can't change till I own who I am.
Amen.
And I can go try to do things and make amends and forgiveness, or and I think that's what the white community does, but then it doesn't internalize it to where it creates an environment of love and forgiveness.
There's that. Thank you. Any other questions, anyone? Marissa.
It's not, I don't know, it's not a question. It's sort of reactions to connecting what you said to what happened at Presbytery and things like that. The first observation is sometimes we focus on one person that said that they don't want to do this anymore, and we give them power to dictate the way that, and we had a bunch of people in that Presbytery meeting, and if one person said something, we're good. And I that's why I despise evaluations sometimes, is that we focus on the bad thing that one person said. Oh, I didn't like the food. And then we think everybody didn't like the food. And that's not accurate. Nobody else said anything about it. So we're giving power to one minority voice or one voice over the voices of everybody else. That's what my first observation.
So the potato salad was good.
Yeah. So the second one is, and this connects to something Shanea said, is that when we moved to the groups, some of us were the only person of color in that conversation, and it felt kind of awkward because it was the presentation was very centered towards whiteness and how white people needed to acknowledge, their racism. And so when we went to, separate groups, and I was the only person of color in that group, I was like, I wonder if we could, if we're having conversations like this, it's the same principle that happened when in the center they started reading Waking Up White, and all the people of color, made jokes about, what if I don't wake up white? How am I supposed to have a conversation about this? And so,
I have yet to do that. I keep waiting. It's yet to happen.
yeah, me neither. So, so maybe sort of a way to get the people of color to meet up in one particular area to sort of then reflect on what did that feel like to receive that information. I'm the first one, and I did say that in front of everybody in that small group, that I'm still learning because I grew up somewhere else where, yes, we have racism in Puerto Rico, but it manifests itself in a very different shape and form in some particular ways. Because none of us can say, oh, I'm white, because we are a mix. If you look at my DNA, my goodness gracious me. So so it's those two things. And the third thing, and I'm sorry I'm talking a lot, but whenever we say Latinx, I just want us to realize that we're talking about multiple stories with multiple points of reference to indigenous people and to the experience of African American people in this country that do connect to some of those. That some of us carry colonialism and imperialism in our histories, and so therefore there's some points of connection to all of this, the main two stories that sometimes we speak about, white and Black or African American, that there are some points of connection there that whenever we talk about Latinx or Latine, there's a complexity in the stories that we all bring to the mix, as people discovered when voting. So
No,
yeah.
you're very right about that. The story of colonialism as it concerns Latinx people in Puerto Rico, we can still unpack that even to today.
Yeah.
And the fact that what Mexico has gone through in connection to colonialism in the United States, and of course First Nation, Indigenous, Native American people, all of those are factors that are important. But also, you once again highlighted something I said earlier about the importance of having two-tier conversations, if not multiple-tier conversations, where it's important for a homogeneous or same group to have conversations first before we can maybe dialogue with others of different races.
Okay.
I think I saw Sue's hand. Did I cover? Are we good, Marissa? Okay, Sue.
This actually is for Marissa. I had read that Latinx or Latinx, probably pronouncing it wrong both ways, but anyway, was created because Latino means male, and you wanted to include females. So X, or not you, but I mean, the term wanted to include men and women. But then the other day I saw something that said, we hate this Latinx. So what is it, depending on where you're from?
Well, it just speaks to that we're not a homogeneous group, that we
Okay.
are, for example, in my own personal opinion, I mean, I like Latinx in English because it's non-binary. That's basically why I like it, because it doesn't assign a particular anything. But in Spanish, the X sounds a little bit foreign when you're speaking Spanish. So we use an E in Spanish sometimes. That's why I said Latinx or Latine. But there are people who don't even like to be called Latinos or Latinas, because that's again, it's sort of it's like Hispanic. It's sort of like makes invisible a lot of the differences and cultural differences.
Category.
Yeah,
It's
You know,
colonialism.
it's like saying Asian and realizing at least we speak at least a little bit of the same language, but saying Asian and mixing all these people up that speak different languages that have fought with each other during, you know, a bunch of, you know, so you know, it does. I refer to myself as a Latina because I acknowledge that that's a way for people to recognize where I come from, but I would rather be a Puerto Riqueña, which is Puerto Rican, or a Caribeña. Now Caribbean folks are cool because our vice president-elect has connections to Jamaica, so and that's Caribbean. So so yeah, I don't know how to, you know, it's complicated.
Well, that helps.
Can I
That
can I
does.
jump into here and say, just piggybacking off what Marissa said, and it's been my experience that people who Americans refer to as Hispanic and Latin X or Latino, they do not call themselves that. That is an American thing. That is something that the United States has made up and put on folks. Folks are more likely to call themselves according to their tribal connection or their land, which is what I
Mhm.
talked about in the beginning. Once again, meaning race is a social construct, and
We
people are
buy.
more, yeah, more about. I'm like Marissa said, I'm Puerto Rican. I'm not Latina. I'm Puerto Rican, and that's
Yeah.
something that's like Americans feeling saying, you know, we could say we're American or North American or United States America, but we have so many other issues to get past. We can't even say that as one united voice in most
Back
times.
in the back in the 70s, when I was working with the National Education Association and membership, our affiliate in Puerto Rico wanted us to send some staff people to help them out. And so we had two staff people that were from Texas that were Hispanic. And so we sent them to Puerto Rico, and we got the most crazy call from the executive director on why did we send them second class citizens. They didn't even speak proper Spanish. And and then all of a
As
sudden
I said, we're racist as well.
there's so many different languages under that umbrella of Latino, you know, from Castilian to Tex-Mex, you know. So that was our mistake and our lack of knowledge and our racism.
Well, Americans tend to be a little racist, given the fact that some folks don't even realize that Puerto Rico is a part of the United States. Just
Yes,
FYI. Not you, Jim, but in general.
I
So,
understand. I'm
yeah,
agreeing
yeah.
with you.
Let's,
Although I have to say, I lived in Puerto Rico, I didn't vote for the president of the United States. Just I always like to make that clarification.
thank
Now I
you.
do, but when I lived over there, no.
Okay, got it. All right, I'm coming to the end of my time, probably over the time that was given allotted to me. But are there any maybe one final question at all, or are we good?
What's
Well,
next?
that is not a question I can answer, but I thank you for your time and your attention during this time and laughing at my corny jokes. John?
Shanea, thank you for being
Thank-
with us. It's been a blessing. If you could get me whatever deliverables you'd like, I will pass them along to everybody in the group. Okay, so they can all have them. If that.
I'll do it before I get up. That's my promise to you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. We appreciate it. You have helped move our conversations much further. It's been great.
Presentation.
It's been great. So friends, we've come to the end of our time for our month. Here's the question I have. I was going to intend us to skip December. Typically we meet on the third, what is this, Wednesday? Yeah, that's the day. Yeah, the third Wednesday at 4. I was going to plan for us to skip December and go to January. Is that, yeah, is that a good plan? Yeah, it's so close to Christmas. We're not going to be thinking, and there are a lot of other things that are going on. So we will skip our time together in December, and we will meet again monthly on the third Wednesday at 4, starting in January. And if you have any other ideas about issues or resources that I can call on, please help me out. I'm doing my best to try to get people I think are really good and interesting, but I don't know everybody. So please help me make this meaningful for you. I think today really helped us out with some good ideas about how do we frame the questions when we do have to talk about issues that are difficult, particularly as it pertains to race. I think Shanea did a great job to help us move to the next step. And in a way, I wish we had had Shanea to help frame things before we saw the video and had the conversation at the Presbyterian meeting. I think that could have been really helpful too. But I saw Angela was taking really good notes too, because it's the National Presbyterian Black Caucus, the Louisville area chapter, that has been trying to plan some of our conversations for the last several Presbyterian meetings. In any event, any burning question or desire? Yes, Anne.
Just remind me how many of our congregations are in Matthew 25?
About 20.
Okay.
So that's about a third to half.
Okay. Thanks.
John, just wanted to let everybody know that the Matthew 25 initiative recorded a video that is like a worship service. And I think I saw the link available on the Matthew 25 Facebook page. So they created this just to use it whenever the church wanted to use a worship service. We are using it on Christ the King Sunday because Marisa hasn't taken a break on on a Sunday in the whole year. So we're using it during that time, and but just wanted to make people aware that existed and that it's available actually in English, Spanish, with Spanish subtitles or whatever, and Korean. So that's out there. I saw Melody Smith, who is the person that is coordinating social media for Matthew 25, sharing it. And the reason why I know that is because I participated along some other Mid-Kentucky folks like David Gimbrell and others. And the one that is the preacher is Diane Moffat.
Right. Moffat.
So
thank you, Marissa. I forgot that. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a great resource. Also, it may be too little too late, but encourage your pastors. If you're not a pastor, this Sunday is the lectionary reading for this Sunday, this coming Sunday, is the Matthew 25 text, right? And that's what Marissa is referring to. That's why it's particularly appropriate that it be on the Sunday, right? But it's available for at any time. But encourage your pastors to engage Matthew 25. Actually, the last 3 weeks, 2 weeks, and then this coming Sunday, it's all been in Matthew chapter 25, right? Last Sunday was the parable of the talents, and the week before was the parable of the bridesmaids, or it gets named lots of different things, but the women with the oil, right?
I'll give a shout out to Pastor Susan. She's been preaching from Matthew 25
Awesome.
For the last several weeks. So
awesome. Good deal, because it won't come around for 3 more years. So in the lectionary, that is. So good deal. Blessings to everyone. Thank you for zooming in. We'll meet again third Wednesday in January. I'll let you know about it and get you the Zoom credentials. Have a blessed Thanksgiving, Christmas, and be kind to your pastoral leaders during this time, and find new and exciting ways to be the church during COVID. Right? Blessings. Thanks.
Blessing, my brother.
Thank you. Thank you, Shanea.